Okay, perfect. I think we can start to begin now. On behalf of our team at the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies, I would like to welcome you to the third session of our CIARS in Conversation web series. Tonight's conversation will be on anti-colonial anger for self-defense, preservation, and liberation. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto is hosted. The sacred land on which U of T is on has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is a territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was subject to the Dish with One Spoon, One Plum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is home to a large Indigenous population, including residential school survivors and intergenerational family members who have been impacted by the history and legacy of the residential school system. Today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to be on this land and work in community on this territory. Beyond simply acknowledging our presence here, it is important for each of us to reflect on the significance of the land as a living space. It is also important for us, both as settlers or displaced peoples, to think about our responsibility to those first stewards of this land. Let no land acknowledgement go by where you don't think about and live up to those responsibilities. We also acknowledge that with the global pandemic, some of us are situated on other Indigenous lands in Turtle Island and across the globe. As such, we encourage those of you that live outside of Toronto to take time this evening to acknowledge the land that you are on. Once again, thank you for joining us for this conversation. Folks, you can follow along with the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag CIARS in Convo. This conversation will be recorded and uploaded to the CIARS YouTube channel shortly after it ends. My name is Kaya. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Toronto, a researcher for CIARS, and I will be one of your moderators for tonight.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Destiny May. I go by she and her pronouns. I'm currently finishing my 4th year of undergraduate studies here at U of T. I'm a poet community educator, and in the fall, I'll be continuing my work pursuing a Master's of Education here at OISE. I have the privilege to co-moderate along with my comrade Kaya this evening. Our conversation will deviate from the previous structure of CIARS in Conversation. Today, this conversation will be discussion-based, as Kaya and I will be asking the questions, but also active listeners and participants. For our conversation this evening, we'll be reflecting on the work of Professor Stanley Doyle-Wood. Dr. Stanley Doyle-Wood is an artist, poet, writer, scholar, and educator in the areas of critical anti-racism, equity, anti-colonial studies, and community engagement. Doyle-Wood's scholarly work and practice lie in analysis and contestation of structural and accumulative forms of racialized violence and spirit inquiry, and the possibilities and praxis of resistance as embodied spiritual acts of pedagogy, survival, and liberation from the standpoint of the historically oppressed. Thank you all for being here. We would like to provide a content warning to those that have gathered with us this evening. For those of us who live with violence on a day-to-day basis, it becomes our second nature to discuss our trauma without remembering the re-harm and harm it may do to others. And that's, as such, our conversation today will include various aspects of our lives that are violent and thus triggering to the audience. If at any time you need or want to take a break and engage in acts of rest and care, please feel free to do so. With utmost care and respect, we appreciate your time and we thank you. We would now like to turn it over to Professor George Day, the director at the Center of Integrative Anti-Racism Studies, or CIARS.
Thank you. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies, I want to welcome everyone, as has been said, and particularly also talk and show solidarity against anti-Asian racism and all the deaths that we have been faced with in recent times. I also want to add that as the indigenous scholar Thomas Keane said when she talked about the question about stories. Stories is all we have, to paraphrase that. I think for colonized, racialized, indigenous peoples, resistance is a central part of our story, our lives. And I think this event is so appropriate for that in terms of how we talk about resistance, but from the position of our anti-colonial anger in order to persevere and to survive and also to thrive. One of the things that CS is interested in is the question of social justice. But our take on social justice is that it should move us into action. And our social justice should be about liberation of the mind, liberation of the body, liberation of our soul and the spirit. That brings us into communities and how we build that communities. And with that said, I think there's nothing that I can add rather than to say, let's enjoy the food for thought that everybody on this panel, particularly Stan, Kia, and Destiny, are going to share with us. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Day. So we hope this conversation provides students, parents, workers alike with tangible ways of how we can practice anti-colonial ways of knowledge, understanding, communication, and expression. Since we will be discussing these topics in depth, we decided not to include a Q&A section, but for those that have submitted questions beforehand, please know that we have taken your questions into consideration while formulating this discussion. Without further delay, let's get started. In Stan's essay, Blood Anger, the spirituality of anti-colonial blood anger for self-defense, he argues that developing a critical consciousness of anti-colonial blood anger is crucial for the survival and liberation of the historically colonized peoples. He also explores ways in which blood anger can be used to enact social change for today's liberation movements, decolonization, self-preservation, and more. So Stan, what is blood anger and how did you come to write about blood anger?
Right. First, I want to thank CIARS for this event and for allowing and providing the space to have this conversation and this talk on anger, anti-colonial blood anger. I want to thank Nana, Professor Day, CIARS members, Julie, Kaya, Destiny, facilitating this, and everyone. Much love to everyone and much respect to everyone who was participating in this. So what is blood anger and how do you come to write about blood anger? So I'll cover this back to front by speaking to the last point, the last part of the question first. So how did I come to write about blood anger? Anger has been a part of my whole life. During the uprisings last summer, in the aftermath of the police murder of George Floyd, I remember watching the TV screens and seeing a young Black comrade saying to a white MSNBC reporter that I'm angry. I'm angry all the time. And then there was a point where the young comrade said, "Anger is in me," and it meant to me that I'm angry at this shit, right? This racist shit, that you have to navigate. You, as in we, have to navigate every single moment, right? That terrorizes and induces terror and fear in us every single moment, every single second of the day and of the night, right? It breaks down our immune systems, right? It fragments us, it disintegrates us, right? That violence, right? And I'm angry at that, right? It is in me. And of course, the reporter was only concerned, with the broken windows out the back there, moved on to another story. And I kept thinking of that young comrade that left, left alone, I wanted to reach out, I wanted to care, I wanted to embrace, through the TV screens. But that anger is in me, has been in me since birth, right? And before birth, right? I've been incarcerated as a child. I've been told that I've been, because I've been angry and too angry I've been on the receiving end of anger at the level of the dominant and also within the family as a result of intercommunal violence. I've been constantly told to control my anger as I've been growing up, and I've been, as a result of that, I've also been then subjected to violence at the hands of the police, not called violence, not called anger, right? But what I've tried to do, what I've attempted to do is to use the anger that is in me, that impacts my entire life, that oftentimes, too oftentimes, has forced me to shut down my voice, to shut down and to keep me into a state of fear. I've attempted to use and develop a means by which to use and take control of that anger in such a way as to develop a theoretical framework with which to oppose the system, to oppose colonial violence and the structures of colonial violence, that which is out there, external and internal to my body. And so this particular piece is very much connected to that, and also then very much connected where I began to write this, feeling that I had tools with which to write, having drawn upon a good deal of knowledge, critical knowledge, anti-colonial knowledge, feeling that I could speak to some of the issues at the time and some of the violences that was engulfing us back in 2014 when Mike Brown was murdered by that terroristic police force in St. Louis, at Ferguson, St. Louis. And so I started to write. In particular, I started to write about a young Black comrade, Kajima Powell, who was murdered several days after Mike Brown. And I wanted to write about that. So I started to write. And so what I will do now is I'll use my own words, tell that story to speak to that second part of the question, what is blood anger? So my focus in this chapter on what I call blood anger started to take shape in another piece of work as a methodological starting point in my attempt to write about the power of resistance and the subsequent death of Kajima Powell. Kajima was a young 25-year-old Black African man who was murdered by 2 St. Louis police officers on August 19, 2014, just 10 days after the St. Louis police murdered Mike Brown, a Black African-American child teenager in Ferguson, Missouri. My intention was to write about the racialization of murder in all of its physical, psychological, emotional, physiological impact, right, and experience. I put my fingers on the computer keys. I type in a few words and then I stop. I break down. I want to talk about Kajima, but I can't move. I can't speak. My body won't let me. I try repeatedly. Each time I stretch my arms out and move my fingers to the keyboard to write. I start to type out a few words, and every time I do so, I draw on the fragments of Kajima's story that I've read and taken in with my whole body. Each time I break up, I can't seem to do it. The pain is excruciating. I see Kajima's face in a photograph, in a newspaper story. He's sitting on a bench with a smile on his face that exudes love for life. And in that moment of camera click, state terror seems to be paused, suspended, refused. It's like Emmett Till posing for a picture in his living room, his arms resting on a television with that beautiful smile on his face. My body's emotion, my heart, my blood wants to hold that moment, to freeze it, to stop him going into that store to be accused by that white woman, that body, that white supremacy, to stop the pain that we as a Black collective feel as we imagine his fear and terror at the hands of white supremacy as they took him from his bed in the night. And we wish that he hadn't felt any terror and pain, but we know he must have, and we keep wishing that it hadn't happened, and we keep wishing we could wish it away. And all of this clashes with my body's memory of Kajima's photo, which clashes against the images of his life and being. My body has stored multiple stories, images, and fragments of stories that news media outlets have disseminated about Kajima. It has stored the contradictions and filtered the depersonalizing from the personalized, the dehumanizing from the rehumanized, the remembered from the dismembered. It has stored his family's remembrance of him coming from New York, of his plans and dreams of how he would love his grandma's cooking and the care and family of his family all around him, and how he would say, "Oh, Granny, this is so good," just like my own son as a child when we would sit in front of the TV with a big smile on his face, his favorite food on a plate on his lap, and he would say contentedly, "Ah, this is the life." My body has a speaking blood memory then that speaks of my children and my family and our histories, on those we know and those we have known, and for whom the collective is we. So I go to the bathroom to compose myself. I go to the bathroom to look at myself in the mirror. I'm crying. I look at myself partly to reassure myself and partly to compose myself, to manage my emotions so that I can come back and write. And I say to myself, pull yourself together, Stan. You need to do this. In the bathroom, I'm wiping my tears away. I'm doing this because those knowledges, those epistemologies, those ways of knowing, those knowledges that teach us how we come to know what we know, that my body is drawing upon these, right, to speak. And they tell me that in order to speak, in order to fulfill the task that I've set myself, I must separate my mind from my body. I must create an emotional distance between the subject matter that I'm writing about and the subject matter that is also the matter of my body. I must not split, bifurcate myself. I must reject my body completely as a place of language and knowledge and blood memory and blood anger and blood enunciation. And through this process of negation, I must tie up my body tongue, that historical racial schema that Fanon speaks to as a definitive structuring of the self shaped through a historical violent encounter with a colonizing spatial and temporal world. This structuring is for the historically racialized and colonized body, woven, as Fanon says, out of 1,000 white supremacists and colonial details, anecdotes, and stories. It's a body schema manifested in bone, muscle, tissue, blood corpuscles, synapses, and spirit by the blood memory of thousands of overt and covert disintacting assaults, injuries, woundings, negations, disconnections, and dislocations accumulated now in my body, not only through my experiences and navigations of an oppressive world since birth, but through the experiences and blood memories of my ancestors who reside in me and who make up my DNA. And so in my back and forth from the keyboard to the washroom to wipe my tears rather, to compose myself, to manage my emotions, and then back to the keyboards I go, only to freeze up in my body spitting movement. I'm negating the embodiment of this historical racial schema in me. And so I cannot speak outside of colonial constraints without neurosis and pain. Through this process, I'm negating the relationship between the racialized body, my body, and the world. I'm negating, repressing, and amputating my body's blood memory. And in doing so, I'm negating the body language, that of blood anger, that my body uses to translate its blood memory, that it uses to organize its defense against dis-intactness and injustice, and to analyze and to contest the fucked upness of the world I've been born into. In the absence of this blood-embodied connection, I'm paralyzed by trauma. And so it is only when I make the decision to refuse this negation in my writing that my body begins to untie itself. My body tongue begins to untie itself, and I begin to speak. Blood anger and its anti-colonial promise are my methodology. My writing from this point on will be a whole-bodied blood anger process. So let me just add a few little words here to that. Blood anger is the boned-in, muscled-in, tissued-in, corpuscled, and blood-celled organic body tongue of the historically oppressed. It is the body's organizing mechanism for self-defense against colonialism's historical and ongoing murderous enforcements of alienation, disembodiment, dis-intactness, and disconnectedness. It is an organic, embodied, organizing mechanism that defends the body in an embodied, intensely focused, fight back, strike back ways. It says physically, psychologically, physiologically, and emotionally, fuck you to anything and anyone that threatens what blood anger reads as an assault against the intactness of its individual and collective body. Blood anger does not simply emerge from nothing. It is an anger grounded in the historically oppressed body's blood memory of oppression, resistance, and struggle.
Thank you so much, Stan. That was undoubtedly extremely powerful and beautiful. And folks can see why we selected your work. Moving forward to the next question, how are colonial perceptions of anger mapped onto us as colonized people? Both Kaya and I were thinking about your example from Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and more broadly, as Black women, we were thinking about the stereotype angry Black woman.
And I draw upon bell hooks in the longer version of this paper, much longer version. And it is also bell hooks and Audre Lorde, June Jordan that I draw upon, to guide me in my navigations of blood anger. So how are colonial perceptions of anger mapped onto we as colonized peoples? Anger is defined, of course, and associated with negativity. These are colonial constructions and colonial perceptions of anger. They're imbued and associated with destructiveness. Anger is something to be controlled, is something to be put down, shut down, and managed. It has been and continues to be racialized, something deviant, something savage, something lodged in the body of Black, brown, and indigenous peoples, right? And something embodied naturally in the biology, right, of Black, brown, indigenous peoples, right, of the historically oppressed. Right? It is constructed as a marker of primitivity, right? A sign of primitivity where the historically oppressed cannot control their emotions or our emotions, right? Cannot reason, cannot manage these emotions because reason is everything. The intellect is everything. Historically, white supremacist colonial constructions of superiority and inferiority construct bodies whose knowledge is connected in their body, in their embodiment, right? Whose expressions of emotion are delivered through our whole embodiment. Colonial constructs that as subhuman, right? The body cannot reason, right? It cannot have control over its emotions, right? It cannot split its mind from its body. Right? And those who are perceived through racist thought as having knowledge expressed emotionally as residing in their bodies, then, marked as subhuman and therefore marked for enslavement, right? Marked for mass murder, right? Marked for mass rape, right? Gunned down, incarcerated, and then medicalized, right? We see colonial science then becoming the agent, of terror, right? This agent of genocide, right? Of looking to correct, looking to manage the anger of the oppressed, right? Looking to segregate the anger of the oppressed, right? Segregate it from the rest of the population for its own good, right? In the media, we see this being reproduced, the justification for this. We see this in schools, right? We see the field of psychiatry, the field of psychology, right? Involved in segregating, involved in medicating, involved in punishing the so-called anger of children of the oppressed, the so-called anger of the racialized, of Black folks, right? Of indigenous folks, right? And an anger viewed as a natural expression, an opposition to self-defense against injustice, is dismissed, is denied, and is viewed as mindless and as criminal. This is where we see policing coming into schools. Right? I recall not too long ago a CP24 moment where a police officer, a nice police officer, was coming into the schools to work with the anger, of young Black and brown children, right? And anger, so forth, then is criminalized and it is delegitimized, right? And To add to that, the colonial power structure has to do this, right? It views the historically oppressed, the colonized, the racialized as insurgents, right? As potential insurgents, made more powerful when our anger is directed at the colonial structure. So it must shut it down, right? It must redefine it, right? It must construct it as something that is pathological, as something, yes, that is mindless, right? And force that definition, that construction into our bodies, right? So that we become pacified, right? So that we give consent to our own pacification. So that it then, once it is suppressed, once it is shut down, that it can continue to do the business of the colonial order by then metastasizing, itself, transferring itself onto those closest to us in violent ways, right? In destructive ways, right? In killing ways, right? Physically, emotionally, psychologically. But there's a purpose so that the colonial structure can continue to brutalize, can continue to murder, can continue to exploit, right? And this process then is an act of warfare, right? Right? On the part of all of these partners in this terroristic colonial system and structure. Ferguson, during the uprising at Ferguson in 2014, the library was kept open, right? The uprising at the anger, right? Generated anti-colonial anger at the system itself, at the colonial structure, at that terroristic police force. The library was kept open. It was left open according to the white librarian director, Scott Bonner, as a means left open so children, local children, Black children, could heal. Right. And Bonner put together what he called healing kits, right? And the healing kits had a picture book and a soft toy that went with it. Right? And so children would come to gain shelter, right? To find shelter, a place of sanctuary, right? From colonial violence. And what do they find in these kits? You find 2 books showcased by Bonner. One called When I Feel Angry, and another called Be Positive, these 2 picture books. And When I Feel Angry is a lesson in a sense of how anger can be destructive. So we must manage and control anger. Yeah. The Be Positive is a lesson in how we can just choose to be positive, So that is the benefit, that is for the benefit of the health of our communities. And meanwhile, of course, with that definition, that construction of anger, right? That control of the body, that shutdown of the body, you have then that white supremacist field of terror, right? Completely denying and dismissing the terror that are implicated when it comes to the mass murder that is occurring on the streets in Ferguson, right? Yeah. The colonized continue, as Fanon said, to be viewed and understood and constructed as a problem to be fixed, corrected, incarcerated, or shut down, right? Yeah. The other aspect, what I would say is that anger is oftentimes associated with rage as something that erupts, right? Again, as something that is mindless, right? As something to be controlled, perhaps even self-censored. Now, I draw on bell hooks for this, right? It is bell hooks that talks about in Killing Rage, mindlessness, the mindlessness, right, of anger. That there is a mindlessness to anger, a particular kind of anger. There's no mindlessness to anger, right? Anger is within our body. It is justified. It is righteous, right? It is our body's self-defense mechanism, right? In the moment there, in Killing Rage, there was a moment there of a racist incident on the plane. And Hooks then says, look, the moment here is to actually begin to write about Killing Rage, right? It is a moment that is very much connected to an accumulation of a racist incidents all through that day, right? And it is this white man who is very much implicated in this, who will not apologize. And so what Hooks does, Hooks suggests in Hooks's body, says, I want to kill this person. I want to stab this person, right? I want to do violence to this person. But then what happens is that then Hooks then moves back and comes back, right? Takes control of her body of their body and says and writes on a pad, killing rage. Well, that to me says that I must control my anger, that I have no other options. I have no option but to if it comes to me wanting to brutalize this person who has violated me, who has raped me, who has beaten me. I cannot do that according to this format, this framework, right? I must cerebrally take control of my anger and write killing rage. Well, I prefer, right? And for me, that is dangerous, right? I prefer to take Fanon's route, where Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask says, when the white woman, colonial body says to Fanon, points to Fanon, look at that handsome Negro. And Fanon says, the handsome Negro says, fuck you, madam, right? And in that moment then, Fanon says, my whole body is no longer paralyzed with fear, right? I am now looking at the colonial structure, right? Squarely in its face, right? I have no fear, I'm not paralyzed. From now, from that starting point, now we can move on, right? Right? So that's, you have to be careful, because if we think about anger as something that simply just erupts, how then can we possibly understand, right, the connections between our blood anger when we're in moments like this, right? How it sits, how it has presence, right? How it's present in our lives constantly, every day. How do we understand its impact in relation to intercommunal violence, right?
Okay, that was thank you for that answer. Thank you for that response. Something that really stuck out to me that you said was the insurgents and the colonizers must shut down the anger and redesign it and force that definition into our bodies. And again, another quote from Fanon that really reminded me of this was, he said, the first thing the colonized subject learned is to remain in his place and not overstep his limits. So with that, we just need to remember that, again, when we have our anger, it is valid, and we can listen to it and we can express it in ways that we feel is valid to ourselves. So to go to our next question, how do we disengage with colonial tools like the formal education system, socio-political discourse, and dominant media, all of which impact our understanding?
We do it. It's a big question. Yes, very much connected to the previous question. We do it at the level of consciousness, and that is not we do it. That is not a fixed, one approach, right? Is to speak to our level of consciousness, right? We all speak about the ways in which, the starting point for liberation is the self, right? And we all talk about self in relation to the collective, right? If we work through blood anger and blood memory, that tension between the way in which our blood angers look to defend our embodiment in individualized terms, right? By avoiding, colonial oppression, right? By amputating, our bodies, looking for a safe place of refuge, right? As opposed to understanding self-defense in relation to a self-defense of our individual selves as relational to the collective and everything around it, right? That tension, right, that conflict that is within us, for me, it becomes the starting point. It becomes then a starting point where we begin to redefine anger, right? We understand that anger, again, as something that not just erupts, right, 1 minute and is gone the next. We understand it as present, as presence, right, and it has a place, right? It is self-defensive, right? It is the organizing mechanism that defends the body against humiliation, right? Against threats to its intactness, right? Against pain, disregard, right? So we can work with that, for me. In the bluest eye, then, the body tongue of blood memory, blood anger is present It has presence, it has place. It is consistently practicing a defense of the self through avoidance of the self, through a rejection of the self, a rejection of the collective self. Right? And so therefore it is suicidal, yeah? Because while it is avoiding, while it is rejecting, while it's hating the self, it is hating the collective and it's hating its whole self. Right? It is the logical consequence of that is destruction, is disappearance, right? A place of refuge, finding a place of refuge, right? Out of an avoidance, right? And that has to be loved, right? There's an understanding, there's a logic to that, right? So let me read a little bit for this. A little bit more here. I know I'm just trying to look at the time here. So blood anger as the body tongue of blood memory is always present. On a constant basis, it organizes itself, and this is the bluest eye, to defend Peccola and Claudia's bodies against the disconnectedness and dis-intactness that is the effect of white supremacy and the systematic enforcement of anti-Black racism. For Peccola, that is essential. Those, of course, who read The Bluest Eye, Peccola, the central character, right? Claudia, the narrator. Peccola finds refuge in yearning for whiteness. That is an impossible whiteness, in the bluest of eyes, right? For Peccola, blood anger organizes the defense of her body and a yearning for whiteness that is crystallized in a desire for blue eyes, while Claudia's blood anger navigates a similar terrain. There is a brief anti-colonial departure. It is anti-colonial because for a moment, blood anger self-defense is in the offense at the colonial structure. Claudia's defensive in the offense, fuck you system, blood anger destroys white baby dolls and dreams of bringing pain to white children. Claudia tells us that the dismembering of dolls, though, was not the true horror. The true horrifying thing was the transference of the same impulses to little white girls. The indifference with which I could have axed them was shaken only by my desire to do so, to discover what eluded me, the secret of the magic they waved on others when people looked at them, these white dolls and white children, and said, but not for me. The isolated Black women as they approached them on the street and the possessive gentleness of their touch as they handled them. If I pinched them, the eyes, unlike the crazed glint of the doll's eyes, they would fold in pain, and their cry not would be the sound of an icebox door, but a fascinating cry of pain. And she goes on to say, when I learned how repulsive this disintegrative violence was, that it was repulsive because it was disinterested, my shame floundered about for refuge. The best hiding place for love then, the best hiding place was love then, right? Thus the conversion from pristine sadism to fabricated hatred to fraudulent love, right? It was a small step then to Shirley Temple, the colonial structure's representation of white child beauty and innocence and perfection. I learned much later to worship her, just like I learned to delight in cleanliness, knowing even as I learned that the change was adjustment without improvement. So anger for Claudia does not hold. But although anti-colonial blood anger doesn't hold, blood anger certainly does. Blood anger in its defense of the body from oppression through the seeking out of a place of refuge by any means necessary and wherever, even if it's in whiteness and self-hate, holds, right? It's not the revolutionary fuck you anger at the system that June Jordan mourns the loss of, for sure. But we've got to love, embrace, and become conscious of the embodiment of the former, or what some folks call destructive anger, before we can get to understand this latter. So in The Bluest Eye, we see this constant, right, disengagement, right, through colonial understandings of anger, constantly this avoidance, this rejection of the self. Blood anger is present and presence and place in Peccola's mother, Mrs. Breedlove. Once again, it defends by seeking refuge in all things white, and the love of for the white child, of the white family, and the white home she cares for. It finds refuge in the smells of their linen and the silk draperies, the child's pink nightie, the stacks of white pillow slips, in the bathing of the white child, in a porcelain tub with silver taps, in running hot water, clear water, in the drying of the white child with fluffy white towels, in the brushing of the white child's yellow hair, in enjoying the roll and slip of it between her fingers. So the refuge of avoidance of blackness is the place of rejection, hate, and contempt,
Blood anger's attack is its defense, and so there is contempt and rejection for Pecula's mother's own household. The zinc tubs, the buckets, the store-heated water, stiff greyish towels washed in kitchen sinks. There's a contempt for the dusty backyard and the tangled black puffs of woolly hair to comb in a white world more delicate, more lovely, clean and neat. And relationally, and by extension and association, Mrs. Breedlove's blood anger as the body's organizing method of self-defense mobilizes contempt, neglect, rejection, avoidance, and punishment of for Pecula and all Black children in her sphere. But the blood memory of Pecula's mother's body tongue is a racialized, engendered memory of anti-Black violence and oppression. It is a blood memory of bruises, collected from moving about the earth, harvesting, cleaning, hoisting, pitching, stooping, kneeling, picking always with young ones underfoot. It is a memory of laughter lost in youth that had been more touched than sound, of an edging into life from the back door as a grown-up into a racialized, violated Black woman of becoming, where everybody in the world was in a position to give her orders, where white women said, do this, white children said, give me that, white men said, come here, Black men said, lay down. It's a blood memory of running the houses of white people, a blood memory of white people beating Black men and of cleaning up then the blood of Black men and then going home to receive abuse from the victim. Self-defense in these self-preservatory, self-protective, unconscious, individualized, body-splitting, and politically decontextualized, brutalized, disintacted, and disconnected colonial context finds blood anger as the body tongue of blood memory, organizing and directing the body toward a place of refuge and safety, manifested in an avoidance of coloniality and an avoidance rejection of its own multiplicative embodied difference, its memory and its collective self. So where I go with that, right? Where I look at that, and I know that I'm mindful of the time here, is that I've experienced that, right? My body anger also moves me, right, towards that story, right, towards that experience, because I have been there. I have felt the effects of this. I've felt the conflict, the rejection. I write in the longer piece of the moment where I'm sexually assaulted, right? The moment where I am sexually assaulted, the moment where I think I'm going to die at the hands of this white body. Somebody comes, it's in public view, somebody comes and eventually I'm escape, I run. And then afterwards what happens is, it is not so much that assault, it's me, my blood angers, defense of myself is to reject what had happened. And it rejects what had happened, it silenced that, it never happened because of course, my blood anger, right? Is transferring and translating the blood memory, that memory that's now lodged in my body, right? As something that is vile, something that has sullied me, right? And it's using colonial knowledge to translate that, right? And so what it does is it circles around and shuts down. It shuts me down. I cannot speak of it. And it paralyzes me, and it disconnects me, and it hurts and it wounds me. And what happens is then, from that moment, in order now, the defense mechanism then is also then to take up misogyny, to take up homophobia, right? That becomes my place. So to pull myself away from that, right? I must begin then to retranslate, to extricate my blood anger, right? And retranslate my blood memory as something that in ways that also can speak to this particular incident as a logical consequence, right, of the colonial structure itself, that it happens to everyone, not to me, right? And this is very much then connected to these colonial constructs of gender, these binaries of male, right, and female, right, forced upon me, because of course this could not happen to me, right? How could this happen to me, right? And so what are people going to think of me? I must shut this down. It is to break free of that, right? And once I break free of that, right? Once I break free of those binaries, those narrow constructs, those destructive constructs, suddenly now, right, I begin to speak, right? I move away from a disconnected self. Now a self that is connected to my body and my body connected to everything around me.
Thank you for that response. One of the colonial tools we're taught in school is to remove our emotion from our work. So like we're taught to look at things from the outside and not put our personal feelings into whatever we're discussing or whatever we're talking about. And I think like what you tell us a lot of the time in class is to situate the I and to do the opposite of that, because especially like as Black students and the topics that we're learning about, we have to be able to like connect it to our body and what we're feeling when we hear about these things, because it's not something that we can just shut out and then write about it passively and then after come back to it when we feel like we're ready. Like, you know, it really does have an effect on our body. So I do appreciate that you're one of the few profs that allow us to do that as students, to really understand what's going on with our bodies at the time.
And I think that is necessary, right? It is to keep you in your place, right? You know, right? You know, it becomes necessary. It is also to produce you then as a racialized, colonized body that can continue to reproduce this status quo, right? You know?
Exactly. So I'm just going to go into our next question. So in your work, you argue that blood anger can be both destructive and beneficial depending on the individual's consciousness. How do we teach our children to shift the destructive manifestation of blood anger to a positive manifestation?
There's another huge question, right? You know, for me, I believe, I feel, right? You know, always in flux, right? Always fluid, right? I feel, and sometimes we talk about an instinctive feel, right? There's also a blood anger. That is also a wholeness of our bodies, right? You know? We talk about blood anger. It's not only when we talk about blood anger, we're talking about those historical struggles, of course, right? You know, that we have been through, but our collectives, I mean, you know, embodied in we, right? Our joy, our love, right? Alternate oppositional ways and conceptual ways of knowing, doing. Right? So instinctively, and my feeling is to move towards self-defense, right? Starting point being the self, right? In relation to the collective. So how do we defend? If we talk about self-defense, what is our understanding of self-defense, right? What does self-defense means, right? What I would say is that we then, starting point will be then to take that and also begin to think about how we redefine anger itself, right? Anger, again, and I keep coming back to this, you know, the definition of anger is something negative, right? Something to be shut down, right? Something to be managed, something to control, perhaps medicated, right? But anger, the root of anger, you know, this is the colonial construct, right? The root of anger. And remember, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, right, talks about, you know, the language being a carrier of culture, right? So, you know, in that word, anger, you know, is a whole set of meanings, right? Colonial meanings in relation to anger, right? You know, that are used as a weapon, with which to put us down, shut us down, keep us down. But the root of anger, you know, is actually the feelings of the body, right? You know. Yeah, it is not this recent colonial culture. It is the feeling of the body. So once we begin to understand, you know, the anger then, right, is something to be embraced, something to be nurtured, something that's present in our body. It is the feelings of our bodies, right? That we have a reaction to this shit, this fucked upness, this colonial fuckery around us, right? And that is how our body speaks, right? Collectively. Then we can perhaps begin to move, right? So we have a project for some time now called the Protege Project for Self-Defense. We have been working, a group of us, right? And we started, a couple of us, two of us, myself, and also a colleague, partner of mine, comrade of mine, right? In a classroom, in grade 6 classroom in the TDSB. Some years ago, we began working, right? Looking to try to put together an anti-colonial, critical anti-racism curriculum together, anti-colonial curriculum together, right? For a group of students, right, who at the time had just been thrown into this first teacher's classroom and essentially dumped, right? You know, essentially nobody could handle them. They needed to be managed. Their behavior needed to be controlled, right? And we started to put together a curriculum that said, you know, look, you know, we are going to take, which is primarily underclassed, right? Black students, right? Outcasted Black students, right? we're going to then begin to reclaim those bodies which are being stolen and continue to be stolen, right? And nurture a sense of revolutionary consciousness. So the starting point then was, okay, let's do this. And what happened was, what began was that we couldn't do this because then all of our folks, all the young comrades, 14 or so, were actually hitting each other. We're killing each other physically, psychologically, well, attempting to kill each other, but also psychologically killing each other, right? With attacks on our embodiment, attacks on our identifications of sexuality, of gender, right, of disability, right? And so it was a scramble for equilibrium, for centeredness, right? By competing with each other, by dominating each other, right? And that was the center, right? That was where the starting point was. That was the expression of anger there, right? So what we began to do then was then to pinpoint, right? To connect the way in which the system itself caused us to do harm and to do violence to each other. Right? And everybody knew the shit that was happening outside. Everybody knew the gentrification that was happening outside, the policing, et cetera, et cetera. So we could have a conversation about that, but we could also then suddenly have a conversation by the ways in which, to talk about the ways in which, once we come together, once we refuse to do harm to each other, to damage each other, that's an anti-colonial movement, right? That is a fuck you to the system, right? So we work together, right? Politically, as a family, right? As a community, as a collective, right? So that's how we began to move, because then from that point on we could then talk about the structure. We could talk about colonial relations of power, right? We could talk about institutional and systemic power, right? Violating power, right? And we can build resistance and nurture resistance, right? From our starting point, from ourselves, where we are at. So what we have now, moving on from that, we have now drawing upon the Black Panther Party for self-defense now. We have that now in motion, right? We have that in action. We have our folks who are now a new set of grade sixes now, who are drawing upon the Oakland Community Learning Center now, taking control, right? Taking ownership of their education, their space by enacting and putting into practice the Justice Circle, right? In the Oakland Community Learning Center, you have the Justice Committee where young comrades there would be go to, right? If anything happened, if there's any violence going on, right? Even if we fell back in terms of our work, because if we fall back in terms of our work, how can we help the collective? How can we support the collective in struggle, right? So they go to a committee, right? And it's the committee that decides, right? The committee says, look, we know, right, what's happened, right? We do this in love. You're not going to be punished, right? Because what is happening ordinarily, right? In this colonial education system, you go to be punished, you go to the principal, et cetera, right? Or you're expelled, right? Suspended, right? But here it is love, right? In the Oakland Community Learning Center, of course, it was a method of correction, right? Which I'm always a bit, about that. But it is love. We have the Justice Circle now, right? It's not a committee, it is a circle. So now everyone, right, makes a decision, right? In terms of speaking to those of us, right? Those of our comrades, right? Who may somehow reproduced, right, harm to the collective, right? Or actually, again, perhaps not taken up some of the material. And what is happening in that circle is we know where you're coming from, right? Because we know what is happening in terms of eviction. So we understand that, right? It is the system itself here at the university, here in the public education system that says, we don't give a shit about you, right? If the structure that's in you leave that outside the door, right? And then you come in, right? We don't care about that. Now the Justice Circle says, yes, we do, right? That is part of who we are. And we work together, right? With love, a revolutionary love, right? A revolutionary consciousness building moment, right? So that is where in action, we begin, the possibilities. And the possibilities there of that moment and moving on from that lie in, of course, redefining for ourselves, right? What anger is, right? Right? And through this action, we create our own knowledge. We know this. We make our own knowledge, right? We produce our own knowledge, right? Not to do that, then it's to the detriment, right, of our survival, right?
That was on how students can be involved in the process, but just for people that are educators within this conversation and are not people of color, how can they also try to start these initiatives or start to engage in this type of conversation when it comes to children within their classroom?
Well, the same applies, right? The justice circle there applies, right? This when we started, the starting point was actually identity. It didn't start there. It was nourished beforehand. Again, going back a few years beforehand, where our folks were competing with each other, right? We're doing violence to each other. We could not, education, anti-colonial education could not take place until we dealt with that. That's starting about being violence. The justice circle moved on from that. Similar is starting point for that is identity. So we begin to talk about identity. I, in this particular moment, in this particular instance, also along with my partner there in the classroom, go in and talk about our identities, right? We break those down. Then we begin to speak about ourselves, right? And our navigations of oppression. And then we begin to link that, right? We begin to allow our folks to speak, and then we begin to link that with the collective, right? And now then we can talk about how we defended ourselves, how we defend ourselves, right? How we defended ourselves as a collective, right? So then it becomes then a question then of nurturing and extricating ourselves away from these colonial constructions of gender, of sexuality, of class, of disability, of making connections between our bodies as a collective, individuals, as a collective, and land and all of our relations, right? So self-defense then is not a self-defense just for the racialized. It is not a self-defense for Black children, for racialized children, for brown children, for indigenous children. Self-defense, if we think about all of our relations, it is self-defense that we're all implicated in, right? And if we're not, then we are complicit, right? We can have those conversations. We have those conversations
now. Thank you. I always love hearing you talk about the work that you're doing at Nelson Mandela School. And I think that the work that you folks are doing there in establishing self-defense and critical thinking in young minds and in educators that may not identify with marginalized identities is so important. I think it coincides nicely with our final question for tonight. So in Blood Anger, you argue that there is a spirituality to anti-colonial blood anger contingent on the untying of the body tongue of the oppressed, and that remembering constitutes a reconnection of that broken connection between us and the rest, which is something that you've already touched on. So what does remembering as self-recovery look like in peace? And how do we establish a connection to global Blackness when it has been amputated by colonialism?
In the huge, bigger question, right? In the piece there, Blood Anger, there is reference to the Kalinago rock, right? My ancestry on my father's side, I'm Black identifying, my ancestry on my father's side, African and indigenous Kalinago peoples. So the rock is in some way a reminder and a connection with the Kalinago folktale. Right? I believe that is how it occurs, right? No coincidence that this huge rock there with carved figures that go back 1,000 years or more. The only rock there, no pebbles, the only rock in this field of bamboo up in the Northern Range, just doesn't happen to be there, right? Outside of our creation stories, right? Tell us where we're coming from, where we're going, who we are, how our relationship to everything around us, right? So there is a creation story whereby it tells of a flood, and the flood emerges, people die, some escape. What happens after that? Everything is destroyed. What happens in the aftermath of that? Tomosi, the creator, comes along,
and says, looks at this and says, look, I'm gonna put this rock there, right here, huge rock, I'm gonna plant it here, right? So if the floods come again, right, that's gonna be there to defend you, right? Collective self-defense, right? It's gonna be there to defend you, right? But, right, you have to talk to the rock, right? And you have to hear what the rock is saying, right? You have to listen to the rock, because the rock is going to tell you when the floods are coming, right? And what happens is then people become so disconnected away from everything, all of our relations, that they forget, right? The forgetting emerges, right? And then what happens is then, of course, there's a floods come and everybody dies, right? So when we did in that story, when we take up our pilgrimage as a family to that rock, and when we run our fingers through the carvings, that what we do is we find a connection, right? A connection between ourselves, those identities we've been told, are not part of us, even though we feel them, we know them, we have to be, right? But these colonial constructs don't allow us even to connect with our own selves, right? We have a connection there, right? We have a connection with land, right? We have a connection that goes back far beyond 1492, right? And that is the critical thing. And then we come down from the rocks, and we find the rock, and we find everything around. We forget that, and we find everything around us now. We're all in conflict with each other. We're dismembering each other, not remembering, dismembering each other, right? On the lines of race, on the lines of class, color, on the lines of disability, on the lines of sexuality, etc. Right? Competing, like in this vicious colonial marketplace, right? So it's that moment there. It is that where we talk about where I want to move in terms of active remembering, because we'd forgotten, because we'd left it there, we hadn't realized it. We thought it was an event. We felt it was an event, not lodged in our bodies, right? So that active remembering, I wanted to take up. I wanted to put on the table, to allow me, in a sense, to reconnect constantly, because all the time I'm faced with this practice of disconnectedness that are being imposed upon me. And that's where my anger is going to go, right? This is life and death issues here, right? I'm not only going to, I could end up doing violence to those beloved ones around me, right? So I'll read a little bit. I'll read active remembering. Active remembering as the core element of anti-colonial blood anger is the defense, the antidote, and the opposition. As an epistemological fuck you war of position, it works to untie our bodies. It is conscienticized to the splitting that our bodies have been subjected to, and it makes the move as an embodied practice of self-defense to oppose and restore that splitting. Self-defense in these contexts is a defense then of all of the relations that constitutes the body of the historically oppressed. Its self-defense lies in a remembering, right? And restoration of the multiplicatedness of our bodies, of the connections between our bodies and the land, and the remembering and restoration of the presence of that same land that resides in our bodies, right? Fundamentally, active remembering works to restore the connectedness between blood memory and blood anger as the body tongue of blood memory. This shift, this embodied movement for self-defense of the collective whole is anti-colonial blood anger in action. In its shift towards its anti-colonial promise, blood anger takes up an embodied listening, hearing, talking back war of positionality with itself and against the oppressor within, one that is imbued with revolutionary love of self, one that educates and coaxes back our blood angers away from those moments when they want to take us back to that refuge of avoidance and rejection of the collective self in defense of a colonial individualized self, or when there is a slippage toward a colonial transition, or rather translation of our blood memories that convinces us that we are helpless, that we are powerless victims of oppression, bereft of agency. Active remembering is restoration of our blood anger, blood memory relations, its reclamation and politicization of our blood memories, its consciousness of what it means to be a collective and what it means to defend and remember that collective in all of its relations is the epistemological grounding that allows blood anger self-defense of the body to make the shift toward a radical anti-colonial offensive against the colonial structure that is external and internal to our bodies. So quickly then, the question was then, what we do in the concept of practice in the second portion. The practice of active remembering, this emerges for me when, and trying to theorize this, emerges for me when I'm in a moment in in a program that I teach at, right? Historical building, right? And I arrive at a meeting. It is a faculty and staff meeting, and I'm told that there is going to be police coming to talk to us, and I'm told that there will be some folks who are going to come and talk to us about supports in relation to sexual assault. Right? And my body freezes up immediately, right? I'm the first one there. It freezes up then in response to police, the word police. So what I do is I'm still working at this, right? I'm in a process, right? Anti-colonialism, right? The anti-colonial struggle is a process, right? No arrivals, right? And so what I do is in my thinking that in my body to protect myself, to defend myself, right? From helplessness, from hopelessness, from feelings of inferiority, because I'm also feeling it's coming back to me that I'm an imposter in this place, right? My background, I'm an imposter here, and then the police, sexual assault, professionals, etc., etc. So in my mind, what I do just for a little moment, one of the acts that I've learned on the way, but not theorized, is that I change the word, I retranslate the word. So it's not police, it's police, right? P-O-L-I-C with caps, lice, right? And I think about that, but I'm still hurting, I'm still painful. I'm wondering, why is this happening here? Why is this coming? Why is these folks coming into this sacred place, sacred space? So then we get to the meeting, and the police officer goes, right? As the police officer goes, my blood memory is triggered, right? I feel all those triggering moments of where I've been hurt, I've been wounded, I've been assaulted by the police in the subway, right? On the go bus, putting their knee into my chest, right? As I come to this country, right? Even though I'm already here, my body is already here in relation to Turtle Island, Stan is also coming, right? Some years ago, knee in my chest, and where is on my chest is my own, 12-month-old baby, but this fucker doesn't care, right? So I have to speak softly, speak slowly, right? I have to defend, right? All of those images coming through. I see blood memory speaks, and then what am I doing? I'm translating my blood anger, translates into, for a moment there, towards an avoidance, a shutdown almost, right? Then we get to speaking about sexual assault, right? And then it really begins to tense. I feel trapped again, like I've always done, right? Again, that defense, right? That anger then, defending itself in avoidance, right? Looking to shut me down, just as I was shut down back then, right? What I do is, and what happens to me, and I've learned this happens to me in these particular moments, pain is felt in my body. It goes to a particular part of my body and it goes towards my right hand. It goes towards this hand in such a way that my hand is paralyzed, right? My hand is paralyzed. Literally, I cannot pick up a pen. And I've been told, my partner has told me in the moments where I'm of rage, right? I'm going to, perhaps take a baseball bat to you, right? To colonialism, right? Just to calm, right? Pull back and maybe just write, right? Because, when you're writing, right, that worries them, right? So I try to write, right? That worries power, right? You're analyzing power, right? I try, but I can't because I can't pick it up. And just for a moment, what I do is I slip back and think, I get into panic, I get into a sense of paralysis, right? I can feel myself disintegrating. But I remember myself by putting my left hand over my right to calm, right? It is my whole body now that is working, right? It is connected with itself, right? And it's then that I ask questions. I'm able, my body forces itself, my blood anger now, an anti-colonial blood anger generates questions now without fear. And so I ask, has anyone experienced have you experienced sexual violence, right? The response is to silence. The whole room is silent, right? It's like you dropped an incendiary device in the place, right? Cannot answer. The answers move and shift towards, well, we talk when we talk to clients this way, and we market ourselves this way. And I said, well, that is the issue, right? How am I coming to you? And these questions now generated by my anti-colonial blood anger, right? How can I come to you as somebody who is a survivor of sexual assault? Come to you feeling that I'm coming to a place that is going to understand where I'm coming from, right? If I was a victim of racism, I would want to come to someone who understands racism and the politics, not gaslighting me, denying me, dismissing me, seeing me as a client. And it is the same now. I come to you as a victim, as a survivor rather, and sexual assault, and now I'm a client, right? I'm a client so that the university can tick me off, right? And send me on my way. And meanwhile, I'm left destroyed perhaps because I've disclosed my story, right? Right? And marketing, right? So this is a neoliberal response, right? Not an anti-colonial response, right? So it shuts down, completely shuts down. And it disappears. But in that moment, right, I had gone some way and moved some way to reclaiming my stolen self. My anti-colonial blood anger had then begun to flicker, begun to emerge, right? And I understood that where I was coming from. Right? I understood that, yes, that is a moment where I can reclaim the self in relation to the collective. Because if I'm shut down in that moment, if I pull back, again, what is going to happen to those closest to me? Right? What is going to happen to myself? Right? Right? Am I going to not want to be here? Right? Am I going to take my life? Right? There's one thing when we talk about the taking of one's life, when we talk about suicide in those particular conditions, in those particular moments. That is the system, and that is the structure that's actually doing that. That is the system that is murdering us. Right? If I do that as a political act, that is another thing. But those are the consequences there, right? And so I pull it back. Now, and I move from there, and you develop theory from that, right? Action, as Cabral tells us, right, produces theory. We make knowledge, right? We produce knowledge, right? So the last question. I think that just that last point, I think that unity, right? It was,
would you like me to remind you of the last question?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, yes. It was just how do we establish a connection to global Blackness when it has been amputated by colonialism?
Yeah. I think there's unity when we talk about amputation. There's unity in refusing amputation, as Fana was saying. There is unity in a struggle, and a struggle that is very much grounded in the self-defense of ourselves, right? That is a self-defense of all of that we are connected to, right? It is a self-defense. It is an anti-colonial self-defense. There is unity in that, but there's also unity in also thinking about not only anti-colonial moves, right? Anti-colonial practices, an anti-colonial positionality, but an anti-imperial positionality. Right? For me, I think that struggle and that refusal of disconnectedness, right? That refusal of amputation, right? Of enforced amputation upon us, right? That nurturing of an anti-colonial, whole-bodied blood anger, right? Provides some possibilities, right? Or a possibility, right? And it is an anti-colonial, it will be an anti-colonial blood anger and an anti-colonial unity grounded in struggle, not one that is also the defense simply, this is the anti-imperial moment, right, of the defense of we, but if all of we are connected to everything around us, then it is a self-defense upon, again, in relation to you, right? Because if I do not defend you, right, then I am killing myself, right? That is where we become and we begin to nurture ourselves as rebel warriors, right, as a collective, right? That is grounded in the Panthers, that is grounded in Huey Newton's notion of revolutionary intercommunalism, right? I think also on top of that, we have to be constantly, right, alert to, right, and refusing of all of that which forces itself upon us, right, to disintegrate us, to disintact us from not only our bodies, but from land and from the land that's in our bodies, right? And I see too often times, for me, the land acknowledgement at the beginning of this conversation was a land acknowledgement. There was an anti-colonial land acknowledgement that understood implicatedness, right? And our connectedness, right? And the imperative that we defend all of that we are connected to, all of that which is a part of we. But too oftentimes I find, that land acknowledgements, right, are problematic, right, are disintegrating, are dismembering. Too oftentimes I find and don't understand the positionality where Black comrades, right, are reciting land acknowledgements that are written for a white power structure, right? So the process, right, the anti-colonial, task and challenge, right, is also one that, in its liberatory practice and its liberatory possibility, right, is one that is of joy, right? It is one that is of love, right? It is one that brings life to us, right?
Thank you so much. I think it's so important that when we're having these discussions, or this discussion in particular about anti-colonial anger, it's important to remember, of course, everything that you just said, but the last point that when we are doing this, when we are defending ourselves in the collective, it is out of joy, out of love, out of life to us. It's a reclamation and remembering of that. So thank you so much for saying that.
I think we have time to answer one question from the audience. So I will just choose one. Okay, so someone has asked, Fanon talks about violence as holy. Is this cathartic, or is holy violence like blood anger?
In my understanding, in my interpretation, yes, there is connections, there are similarities, right? Because what Fanon is talking about there in terms of catharsis, right? Is that the anger that is suppressed and trapped in the body. Remember, colonialism, right? Leaves no outlets, right? For the colonized to express anger. In some sense it actually does, because Fanon was trying to suggest, yes, it does. The outlet that is aimed is directed at the self, right? And so that's an outlet. There's some catharsis there, and also those are the moments, right? Those are the starting points then where, because this is where violence integral to the process of decolonization, anti-colonization. This is where the seeds then, right? Of understanding and making connections between that violence that we do to each other, right? And which we're forced to do to each other, right? And the violence, right? That is the structure itself. Remember, the last moments, the last chapter in Wretched of the Earth, right? Fanon is saying, look, once we get rid, right? We get rid of the oppressor, right? The Algerian struggle, right? We get rid of the oppressor. We got rid of the oppressor, right? But then we had to have a conversation, right? A national conversation, right? Of how the oppressor was still, etched and lodged in our bodies, right? And determining, influencing, and shaping our relationships to one another. So even though the oppressor is physically gone, the oppressor has not gone, the oppressor is within we, right? So it is a shift there, right? Blood anger, that blood anger that is centered on self-preservation, individualizing, drawing upon, colonial knowledge to interpret, right? Blood memory, right? Small, tiny, right? Shifts, is a victim, is a helpless, is powerless, right? And so it has to find an outlet, right? Self-hate, rejection, avoidance, right? And then the shift moves towards, right? An understanding of self-defense, the individual in relation to the collective, right? And so what happens is now we defend the collective itself, right? How do we defend our collective, right? We then understandably right then and then we become conscious of the collective and conscious, right, of the collective's experience of struggle, right, in relation to this power structure, right? Mrs. Breedlove is not conscious at the moment of understanding that what is happening is it is violence, it is suicidal violence. It is also then directed at her own individual self and that of the collective. So there are, yes, but it is a stage, when Fallon is talking about, that is a stage, that is a movement of us, right? That is a journey, right? We move from that point, right? It is not fixed at that point of catharsis, right? We can't leave it there, right?
I think just really quickly, if we have time, a question that connected to what you're talking about with the collective that we also got earlier was, how do we deal with the Black spies in the Black community who seek to infiltrate and destroy?
There's a huge, big question, right? On that, again, that is, of course, that is the the history, right, of the Panther movement has been the history of the anti-colonial struggle, right? Those kind of impositions, right? Those kind of infiltrations. I was listening to a webinar with Elaine Brown, former Black Panther Party leader, who said, what we had was corporal punishment, right? And we just kick folks out, right? If we understood as a collective, we don't know at the moment, right, whether that is an infiltrated body, but if you're part of we, then, we looked, right, to try to, your politics, right, is in opposition to we look to try to nurture you, look to try to bring you, right, with us, right, because at the moment, even in your politics you are, right, a danger to the struggle, a danger to we, right, and if you cannot do that, right, then you kick those folks out, right. This was Elaine Brown's point, right. That would be, my position, right? But of course, what it is, I don't know any particular moment, any particular instance, any particular experience, right? I think, one of the issues here is also that we, when it comes to organizing, we might think about organizing here, right? I think if we organize, for me, in a way that is not an organizing format that is grounded in a few elitist individuals, right? But is actually grounded and dispersed, right? On the ground, amongst the people, right? I think we could go some way to avoiding that, right? I mean, there are moments, of course, where, those small cells, if you like, right, are critical, but there's no reason why you cannot have those small cells dispersed around our collectives and our communities. So that is a huge question, and I think it's also a question, that I'm going to have to reflect more on, because I'll tell you, but it's not to. It is also something that is, I struggle with, right? One of the other issues is, of course, we want to be careful because the system makes us, turns us into, develops and nurtures a paranoia in us, right? A paranoia that, where we begin then to ourselves engage in doing damage, right? To those around us, right? We become disconnected because as a result of that paranoia. Right? So I'm gonna have to reflect on that. Because of course, again, as I said before, it is a critical question, one that has actually been instrumental to the demise, right, of many of our, revolutionary movements, moments, organizations. When I leave, I know what's going to happen here. When I leave, I'm going to go, oh, yes, I know that is what I should have said, right? I know that is what I was thinking, of course, yes, that's what I want to say. That is what I want to put into practice, right? And there's something there, there's something working around. I know it's there. It's something that my blood angle will have to remember that, Yeah.
We'll get back to it.
Yeah.
On the next episode.
Well, we want to thank you so much for your time, your contributions, your knowledge, just everything that you had to offer us this evening. So to wrap up, because we are running out of time, unfortunately, I'm just going to give a quick summary. So in this discussion, we discussed the collective circulation of blood anger and blood memory, Blood anger and blood memory are co-constitutive. They are living within all of us. And without acknowledging the contradiction of colonialism and white supremacy, we are unable to engage in untying of the blood tongue. Our conversation with Stan is a continued practice of his work, a reclamation of epistemologies and praxis that transcend colonial and white supremacist boundaries and concepts of time, space, and knowledge. We hope that our conversation has provided you all with the necessary tools to do anti-colonial work.
On behalf of CIARS, thank you all for joining us. We would also like to thank the Delmar Buddy Day Learning Institute for partnering and supporting CIARS in conversation. If you're interested in keeping up to date with future CIARS initiatives and events, follow us on Twitter at OISECIARS, that's OISE CIARS. We will see you again for our next webinar. Have a good night. Oh, and a friendly reminder that the conversation is recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube shortly after it ends.
Much love, much respect to everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Stan. Bye.